I really want to thank you for this opportunity to share today. And last year, my wife and I attended this conference for the first time and had a delightful experience just fellowshipping. And it's a really special community that you have here at Tyndale House. And to be part of it again this year, it's just a delight. I was sharing with Caleb earlier that it's refreshing to have the scholarship that you hear about here and to have it in a smaller community. You know, you go to ETS or SBL or some of these larger venues and you have all these people, and here you just get an opportunity to meet more people and interact. So it's been good to be here with you again today. And I thank you, Caleb, for inviting me to give the Biblical Archaeology annual lecture for Tyndale House this year. This last weekend, I visited the, okay, this is not going to work. Let's see here. There we go. I visited the British Library. Some of you have been there, and I'm sure in London, and I was able to see for the first hand. I haven't been to the British Library since it moved from the British Museum. Now, that was a long time ago. So anyway, it was great to be there and to see firsthand the New Testament that Tyndale published. 1526. The label said 1534, but that's good at any rate. And after tireless efforts, were made to hunt down every last copy of that New Testament. Only 3 survive, as many of you know. One there, one at St. Paul's in London, and one in Stuttgart, Germany. And Tyndale once said that the ban to publish Bibles was to keep the world still in darkness. And he vowed, of course, that all from princes to plowboys should have access to the Word of God. And today, thanks to men like Tyndale and Luther and Zwingli and Robespierre and others, we have the privilege of having the Bible at our fingertips. We have it in our homes and in our offices, and we can download them and have access to them through the internet, 100 translations if we want to, and more. And it's just amazing to think about that and to have that. And yet today, I think we also are struggling in facing an increasing darkness when it comes to the Word of God. In large part, it's because the confidence in the Bible's history itself has been eroded during the last 200 years of modern and postmodern revisionism. And the narratives and its heroes have been relegated to the dustbins of legend and fables. The very historical essence is altogether denied. Their stories reinterpreted within the latest hermeneutical trends. And to use a turn of phrase coined by Tyndale and also found in the King James Version, there's nothing new under the sun. This has been happening for a long time. In ancient times, there were attempts to literally erase the existence of individuals that posed some threat to power or future claims. In New Kingdom Egypt, some believed it was Thutmose III who attempted to obliterate the memory of his predecessor and co-regent Hatshepsut, the most important female ruler in Egypt. He did this by having her image erased from monuments and temple walls that she had built, a process called damnatio memoriae. Thutmose was successful for some time to erase her from history. Over the centuries that followed, none of the king lists, the ancient king lists of Egypt, mention her. It was only after the decipherment of Egyptian in 1822 that Hatshepsut was rediscovered and is now recognized as one of Egypt's great pharaohs. In a sense, the practice of damnatio memoriae is taking on a new dimension today. The modern and postmodern trends in our current culture are less generous than Thutmose III perhaps was. The Bible is not rewritten so that the heroes of the story are erased or taken out. Our modern translations still contain the names of these people and the events that are surrounding them. But instead, critical scholarship claims, largely on the basis of the lack of evidence, that many of these people probably did not exist in history and that their stories are to be understood merely as literature, a kind of historical fiction, if you will. Tyndale's words that the scriptures sprang out of God often falls on ears that find such statements unbelievable in an information age overwhelmed with data. and so distract us and occupy us that essentially deny the very power and authority that Scripture claims to be God-breathed. So I don't take the invitation to be here lightly today. We're living in precipitous times. One could argue momentous times. There's so much happening in our world, economically, politically. And honestly, they don't always guarantee that such fellowship as we're experiencing here this week is guaranteed. And so this calls us to reflection today. And thank you for the prayer that you gave earlier. Appreciate that. Until the Enlightenment, Jewish and Christian scholars had taken the biblical text at face value and largely accepted that the history and authorship ascribed by the text was to be trusted. The first 5 books, the Pentateuch or Torah, was assumed to have been written by Moses during the time of the Exodus and was dated on internal evidence to the late Bronze Age or 2nd millennium BC. With the Enlightenment, scholarship began to question not only the authorship, but the dating of these books based on the lack of an alphabetic script, largely for writing, or the lack of literacy, presumed literacy. One of the primary reasons for assuming this later date was the lack of a known alphabetic writing system and perceived literacy in the 2nd millennium. Of course, the discipline of archaeology had not yet been born when these ideas broke upon the scene, and so one might excuse such an assumption as being based on ignorance. We need here to give a very brief account, perhaps, of these arguments in biblical interpretation that many of you are very familiar with, so we're only going to kind of skim over the surface here. But I think it's still important, and this is kind of what we're going to go over in the next few minutes before I get to the ivory comb, if you don't mind. I won't mention all these people by name, but some of them we need to. F.A. Wolf, a classicist who employed source-critical analysis to the Homeric question, that is, the composition history of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, in 1795, was one of the first to question literacy at the time of Moses and mocked the possibility of Moses wandering around the Sinai with large supplies of papyrus to write down the first books of the Bible. Pioneers in biblical source criticism, yes, that's where that would have occurred, somewhere in that region. Pioneers in biblical source criticism, Willem de Wet and Johann Eichhorn, were heavily influenced by Wolf, who was a fellow student and colleague of theirs. John Van Seters suggests that the source-critical method employed by Wolf in Homeric studies, quote, soon finds its way into Pentateuchal studies and becomes basic to the new documentary hypothesis, end quote. In 1883, Wellhausen, in his Prolegomena zur Geschichte Israels, would codify these sources that had been suggested by earlier scholars. Wellhausen himself was not very assured about Jay's dating, stating, one cannot give precise information for a period early than the century before 850 to 750. It was only at this time that literature flourished. In his Prolegomena, he dates it to the golden age of Hebrew literature, the period of the kings and prophets which preceded the dissolution of the 2 Israelite kingdoms by the Assyrians. Notice in both of these places, Wellhausen placed the text at a time when he believed writing flourished. Even as late as 1971, Gerhard von Rath, perhaps Germany's most influential 20th century Old Testament scholar, would place the Yahwist during the reign of Solomon, also assuming that the court of the monarchy provided a logical setting for writing. Von Rath's students, Rolf Rentorf and Erhard Blum, began to question these assumptions. They settled on largely 2 sources instead of 4, D and P, which they dated during and after the exile. They rejected the Yahwist as a source. These are 2 of the books that I'm referencing here. Vorländer in 1978 argued that the Yahwist should be dated to exilic or the post-exilic period with a terminus ad quem of 400 BC, making a case against the views which dated the Yahwist to the 10th and 7th century BC. Emerton, of course, responded to that hypothesis. Thus, by the late 1970s, the long assumed date for the earliest sources of the Pentateuch shifted from the monarchy of Solomon to the very end of the kingdom and even after the exile. And I was in Craig Bartholomew's lecture today, in which he lamented that in most circles at SBL today, you don't even talk about a Yahwist much anymore. I will never forget the 1986 plenary address to the International Society for the Study of the Old Testament in Jerusalem. I was there with my father, tagging along as a 17-year-old. But I was at the banquet at the Knesset, where we were addressed by the president of Israel. And I remember there were two plenary addresses, one by Rolf Lenthoff from University of Heidelberg, and the other one by Cyrus Gordon, whom many of you know from various places. But Rolf Lenthoff kind of set a very different tone. Later, his address was published in Interpretation, entitled "The Paradigm is Changing, Hopes and Fears." Lenthoff, in his address, challenged the status quo by stating boldly, quote, "I believe that the traditional documentary hypothesis has come to an end." And he argued for a new approach, which he referred to as canonical theology, that approached the Bible in its final form as a whole document. The end of the documentary hypothesis that Lenthoff declared in 1986 has been called by some the collapse of history. Leo G. Perdue defines this collapse in terms of the postmodern rejection of the historical referent behind the text, whereas Niels Peter Lemke defines it as the loss of connection between the biblical narrative and real history, as he calls it. This gave rise to a whole new development. The postmodern shift was formalized in 1992, just 6 years after Renthoff's plenary, with Philip Davies' book, In Search of Ancient Israel. Davies attempts to reconstruct all of Israel's history in and after the Persian period by rejecting the Iron Age as the setting for the Bible's history. Davies simply refers to the silence of the archaeological record by observing that the biblical empire of David and Solomon has not the faintest echo in the archaeological record as yet. Good caveat to add at the end of that sentence. In other words, the purported lack of evidence for texts in the Iron Age pointed to the lack of a written language altogether. For Davies, the language of Hebrew served as a Bildungssprache, an artificial literary language that was invented by late scribes in the Hasmonean period. This radical new hypothesis of history and the origin of the biblical text opened the door for colleagues to redate most of the canonical books to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. I still remember at a meeting that I was in some years ago, I think it was when SBL and ASOR were still together, it was in 92 or 93, Davies had just published it. And I remember my major professor, Bill Deaver, getting up and saying, "My friend, you are working yourself out of a job." It was possible now to largely deny the existence not only of Moses, but David and Solomon altogether, following the ultimate logical conclusion in a trajectory that earlier dismissed the patriarchs and the Exodus conquest accounts. Even when the Tel Dan inscription was found in 1993, the very next year after Davies published his hypothesis, mentioning the house of David, the very same formula referring to the kings of Judah used in Kings and Chronicles, Davies refused to change his views, going so far as to call the stela found at Tel Dan a modern forgery. In the 1990s, Thompson and Lemke and Whitlam, and others followed suit in their critiques. Thompson wrote, "It is only a Hellenistic book that we know. The Bible's Israel is a literary fiction. There never was a united monarchy in history." Lemke states, "The Israel of the Iron Age proved to be most elusive. In historical documents," notice this again, "as well as in material remains," and concludes, "At the end we have a situation where Israel is not Israel, Jerusalem not Jerusalem, and David not David." Some have gone even further in the last 5 years or so. I don't know exactly how to pronounce this name. Lukas Niezilowski Spano now places the Abraham and Esau Jacob stories in the late 2nd century to early 1st century BC. I mean, you wonder how late they can go. What's holding them back? It's got to be the Dead Sea Scrolls. It has to be something, But anyway, I'm wondering when Paul's going to come into the question, but I don't know. The arguments presented thus far were not isolated to literary and compositional matters of the text itself, as we have seen, but were related directly to assumptions regarding the perceived existence or lack of existence of texts in the archaeological record, the availability of the alphabetic script, the development of written language, and the literacy of the culture at those times, coupled with a synchronic focus that had moved away from history altogether. Bill Schniedewind in 2004, also looking for a logical place where writing flourished, suggested a middle ground, moving the date from David and Solomon to the 8th through 6th centuries. Part of his reasoning is that hundreds of Hebrew inscriptions of a variety of types testify to the widespread use of writing during the Judean monarchy and the marked increase of epigraphic finds in the late 8th century. He continues to write, although alphabetic writing made it much easier to learn to read and write, more than a millennium passed after its invention before we have evidence that literacy actually spread beyond the scribal classes. That's the question we're going to address tonight. We must ask, on what basis does he hit that conclusion? He clarifies, early alphabetic texts were quite limited and suggests that writing still had a restricted role in society. Again, one could suggest his argument is motivated by an argument of the absence of evidence and the presence of evidence during the 8th century to 6th century in question. Finkelstein and Silberman, two archaeologists 2 years later, follow with the same argumentation in their book, David and Solomon, stating it is highly unlikely that the David narrative can be dated to the 10th century because not only is there no evidence of an elaborate royal administration of the type that might have expected to possess literary scribes and court bards, there is no sign of extensive literacy or writing in Judah until the end of the 8th century. In fact, the same argument is made in all periods in the history of biblical interpretations, as scholars have systematically shifted the dates for the texts, either claiming the lack of evidence for extensive writing and literacy or maintaining that their chosen period has the most likelihood for the production of the biblical corpus. Their arguments, for better or for worse, were informed, or in least most cases not informed, by the archaeological record. All of these arguments rely on the presence or absence of texts, not biblical texts, but texts in the archaeological record. And as an archaeologist, I would just like to ask the question, why? Why is there no sign of extensive literacy? Is it because literacy did not exist? Or could it be a combination of other factors? What did the ancients write on? Were those writings preserved? Were they preserved? And we know that certainly in the majority of Judah and of Israel, what we know as Israel today, that certainly wouldn't have been preserved unless it was close to the Dead Sea in a very dry environment. Or is it the fact that although there's a rich history of archaeological research in Israel and Palestine over the years, that much of it still remains unexcavated? And much of it in urban centers like Jerusalem may in fact be completely covered by later and modern buildings. I've worked in this country for 40 years, and I can tell you we've only barely scratched the surface. I mean, it's just so extensive amounts of things that still can be uncovered. And whenever a road or a building goes in, new discoveries are being made. So I want to turn then to the question of archaeology and history. And I want to simply quote a person that I worked very closely with for many years and continue to work closely with, my Dr. Fata, who challenged the postmodern revisionists, some of whom we've just quoted, in stating this in his 2001 book. The revisionists tend to distort or even ignore what many now see as the primary source for writing the history of ancient Israel, namely modern archaeology. It was archaeology, in fact, that revealed the ancient writing systems of Egypt and Mesopotamia, beginning in the 18th century. And as these systems were deciphered in the following century, no one claimed that writing did not exist in the biblical world. But the first writers of the Bible did not write their biblical books in the complex hieroglyphic system of Egypt or the cuneiform system of Mesopotamia, at least not as we have them today. Although some have argued that writers like Moses and Daniel would have received training in those writing systems, the Bible was written in an alphabetic script. Sumerian and excuse me, I'm not a Sumeriologist, so I know that on the one side here we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I don't know if that's a Sumerian text or not. I don't read the language. But anyway, these are cuneiform texts at any rate. Caleb could tell us more. At any rate, Sumerian, I understand, had about 1,000 distinct signs, or up to 1,500 if variants are included. The adaptation of cuneiform from Sumerian to Semitic Akkadian carried over this idiosyncrasy of Sumerian logograms, which were mixed together with syllabic writing in Akkadian, where each character corresponds to a syllable. By the old Akkadian period, there were only about 600 syllabograms, and 200 of those syllabograms were used frequently, but this was still much more complex than an alphabet. The Egyptians, on the other hand, Egyptian contained hundreds of hieroglyphs or glyphs. In the Middle Kingdom, there were about 800 to 1,000 glyphs. By the Greco-Roman period, there were over 5,000 glyphs in existence. The Egyptian language in all its complexities was apparently not one that many people mastered in antiquity. Recent scholarship estimates that literacy during the high point of Egypt's history in the 18th, 19th dynasty was as low as 1%. This is based on Baines and Eyre and Wendt. Thus, the role of one who could read and write was deemed especially important. As Wendt writes, scribes were the intellectual elite of the land, the principal artisans of high culture. The earliest form of the alphabet used in Egypt was found isolated in the desert and carved on rocks in the Wadi el-Hol, north of Thebes, and in the Sinai Peninsula at Serabit al-Khadim. And based on these inscriptions, there have been strong arguments made for the origin of the alphabet based on Egyptian phonetic orthography, that is, the hieroglyphic script, although not all scholars are agreed on which or how many letters in this early alphabet derived from Egyptian, or whether it was more likely that they derived from the hieratic form of Egyptian writing. All of these questions remain open to discussion today, but today we're here to not discuss all of this history, but to add some new data, and that's the Ivory comb, with its first complete sentence written in an alphabetic script found in Canaan. And I'm going to go off script now, because this is what I'm most familiar with. That's okay. So we excavated the fourth expedition to Lachish. As you know, there have been 4 expeditions. The first was the British expedition in the 1930s, led by John Leslie Starkey and Olga Tufnell. And then we had, of course, 2 Tel Aviv expeditions, the first one by Yohanan Aharoni, and the second, for the longest expedition, for over 20 years by David Yushishkin. And we came along in 2013, incredible privilege to be working at this site, to direct a new project after we had been working in the area of the Shephelah for several years already. It was a joint project between the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and our university. The Israel Antiquities Authority, of course, gave us permission to excavate every season. The Israel Exploration Society is where we will be publishing our final report volumes, which I'm working on right now. We were CAP affiliated with ASOR, also with the Israel Nature and Parks Authority. Lachish, as you know, is a national park. And more recently, I want to thank the Albright Institute for providing a venue where I could work on more material, or this material that we've excavated over the years. We focused our work on the northeastern quadrant of the site, so opposite of where the siege ramp of the Assyrian campaign is located, and opposite of the main gate of the city as well. Why? Because we have a major well here that probably dates to it's underneath the line here, but there's a huge well here, and the water system that probably is underneath the tree that is growing in the middle of it over here in the Great Depression that we have in that area. The British had done some work over here. They couldn't excavate for a number of years the surface of the site due to land problems and agreements with the local Arabs that they were working with. So they worked kind of along the edges. They found the Phos Temple over on that side and did different things. But here, this is the area that's facing Jerusalem. It's the area closest to the river that goes by, the wadi that comes by in the north. And we thought, and it's the least excavated area, and so we thought we would come here. This is the area that I will be speaking of specifically. And right here underneath that line is a temple known as the Solar Shrine that was excavated in 1966 and 1968, interrupted by the Six-Day War by Aharoni. And you can see the nice squares there. And he found a complete sequence of all level 1 down, the temple dates to level 1, all the way down to level 6. And we thought we wanted to check that dating and check that replication and replicate that if we could. So just to give you an overview of what we're talking about here, we have obviously the modern surface of the site. Level 1 is the Persian period after it was reoccupied, after the people came back from the exile. We have the Babylonian at level 2. This is the final destruction by Nebuchadnezzar on his way up to Jerusalem in 586, 587. We have level 3, the 701 destruction by Sennacherib, level 4 and level 5. We, of course, have to excavate and document all this as we're going down. This is the responsibility we have as archaeologists, but our real goal, and why it took us 5 years to get there, was level 5. This was the least known from all the previous expeditions, and very crucial to our research questions, which was to elucidate what was happening in the 10th century, and particularly with Israel's first kings. We had already been excavating at Khirbet Qeiyafa in relationship to the question of Saul and David, and now the question was, how did the kingdom continue? And of course, we won't get into all the dating because that's not our focus today. That was last year's presentation, so let's continue. So here we are. This is our area AA, where the comb was found. You can see a couple of cars here just for scale. This is Aharoni's digs over here, and we worked right adjacent. In fact, just 1 meter away from where he sunk his trenches is where we sunk ours. So we could follow very clearly his sequence. The palace fort here is the largest Iron Age building ever found in the entire area of Israel. It's a palace that definitely belonged to the kings of Judah. It has its own gate over here going into the palace courtyard. The palace courtyard extends around here. There's the corner. There's another part of it. And this is the gate going into it. Quite extensive. It's all kinds of ideas about what went on in the palace over here. But we were working just adjacent outside the palace walls. Notice that all of our buildings are lined up with the palace courtyard wall. And in fact, that was true going all the way down, which is very important, as I mentioned last year, because it would indicate that the palace was there already, also in the early periods, as the British, as your predecessors had already concluded long ago. And we would agree with them on that. That's, of course, been challenged to a large extent today. 13,000 square meters is this area. It's huge. And of course, you remember the account of King Amaziah fleeing for his life to the city of Lachish, where he was pursued and killed, and his body brought back for burial in Jerusalem. So the comb, let's get to the comb. This is Catherine Hasler. She's my former student. She's now a PhD student at Lipscomb University with Steve Ortiz. And she was the person responsible for the unit or square where the comb was found. And I will speak quite a bit about her because thanks to her expertise and her attention to detail, we have the information that we have today. Lachish was a training field school project where we had 60 students and staff from Southern Adventist University, a total of 110 to 120 people from 16 countries in the field for those 5 seasons. And we were training students and archaeology students on how to become archaeologists. And Catherine was with us for 4 of those years. We put her straight into the trenches as a square supervisor her first year without any experience whatsoever, and she flourished as a result of that. It was the first day of excavation in 2016, June 20 to be precise. We put down these geotextile material, kind of a felt material over the top of the squares the previous season in order to protect the area from the erosion that would come down during the winter rains that would happen here. And to protect the unexcavated areas, if you will, from contamination from materials above. Because when you're dating things and when you're trying to figure things out, you don't want, something from level 1 suddenly showing up in level 3 down below. That would mess you up big time. So this is how we protected things. This is actually at the end of one of our seasons here. This is not what it looked like when we came at the beginning. It was, there was more erosion there. We didn't have these are the labels for all the different strata that we're working through, all the different loci that we're working on. So Catherine and her team in OD 25, that's the square, we're taking away this and brushing off the area to begin excavation once that geotextile was removed, just cleaning the area, making sure there was no possible contamination when they began to excavate that particular day. This is the team here. This is Catherine, the square supervisor. This is, I wrote her name down. I always forget her name. It's terrible. Megan Weingartner, sorry. This is my colleague, New Testament scholar and fellow colleague at Southern, Dr. Edwin Reynolds and Catalina Hanna. And then we also had working with us that year, the very enthusiastic Judith Manchai, who just found some really cool stuff from Sennacherib's campaign here, or at least from that time period. So that was really a great thing. This was a day, a very exciting day. They had begun to excavate. Catherine was working with her team, and all of a sudden in the corner of the square, and we'll show you exactly where that was in a moment, in the corner of a square, they found a small object, 2.5 centimeters, just tiny like this. You'll see it in scale in a moment. It looks blown up on the screen, but you'll see it also as somebody holding it later on. Very tiny object. It was covered in dirt. Nobody knew what it was. It kind of looked weird because it was very flat. It looked underneath the dirt, although you're careful, you don't want to remove the dirt necessarily. There was, it looked like bone. It looked like bone. Now we find a lot of bones, and we keep all the bones because we not only are interested on what people built, but we also are interested in what they ate, what their diet was like. And so we have a zooarchaeologist that works with us, and it was very advantageous that day that he was around. I'll get to that in a moment. This is the same square. This is Josh holding up a bone, but not the one we found. So anyway, these bones get put in bone bags. These are just paper bags, but all the information from that locus and from the area and all the details, the elevations, all of that is there. It's put together with the pottery bucket with the associated pottery so that it can be dated later as well. And those bones go back to camp where this gentleman, Dr. Ed Mahar, our zooarchaeologist, is analyzing those bones. Now, I've been working with Ed Mahar for a long time, since the early 90s at Ekron in the Philistine site. And Ed lives in Chicago, and he was with us that particular day. And he was actually in the field, and he saw this, and he looked at it, and he says, I'm going to get to that right away. He didn't have a backlog because it was our first day of excavation. So we get back, and during the period of our siesta, while I was sleeping, he was working because he didn't get up as early as we did in the morning. And then he came to us excitedly at about 4:30 and said, look, I've cleaned the objects, and yes, it's bone, but it's more importantly, elephant tusk ivory. It's ivory. And not only that, but it's worked, and it is an ancient comb. It's an artifact. So now something goes from being simply a bone to something that was fashioned by an individual, and it becomes an artifact. And so that goes into its own little object box. In our case, it was a box about this big, just to fit it, nicely. And that got its own object number, and it was recorded, and everything was done precisely. And sorry to bring this up, but it got put away in storage someplace, okay? If you remember this movie. And it was taken to Jerusalem, and it was put away in storage, quite frankly, because we can't deal with every single artifact in the field that we find. We have to wait on post-processing to take place. We find millions of bits of data in a 5-season project like this, and we have various experts that work on these materials after the fact, whether they're Egyptian scarabs, like I just finished I'm going to give a paper at ASOR this fall on that, or whether it is something like this, or whatever find category we have, whether it's lithics, it all needs to be processed and looked at. Now, unlike the Ark of the Covenant, time didn't go by not that much time went by. Only 5.5 years went by. And in our case, one of our colleagues, Dr. Madeline Mamshuglu, a biochemist and a pharmacologist who had joined our project some years earlier already in Caiapha, was very intrigued with these combs. We had two of them. She was intrigued because one of her relatives was in fact one of the world's experts on hair lice. And combs were used to remove hair lice. So she had worked in labs her whole life, and she wanted to investigate these combs microscopically to see if any kind of remains of lice might be found between the teeth. Yes, believe it or not. Now, Madeline is a very interesting person. She, some of you may know this product. She is the patented inventor of, not elderberry, obviously, that's a natural thing, but of this particular brand of elderberry. She was the one that did all the original research on elderberry extract and its use in immune, building your immune system. So she's a multimillionaire who now has gone into a second career of archaeology and has done wonderful work with us over the years. And here we have one of the combs, one of the two combs that we found. This is the bone, the one made out of bone. You can see it just has teeth on one side, but she was analyzing that. And then the ivory comb, and here you can see it has two sides. You'll see the entire comb in a moment, but here you have the thicker teeth on one side of the comb. There are 6 of those teeth that were probably used to detangle the hair of a beard, perhaps. And then you have very fine teeth on the other side of the comb. Now, when I've given this lecture in various contexts and different universities and things, I've had different people in the audience, and I've had dermatologists and nurses in my audience, and they're like, well, we make them the same way still today. And I actually have had people come up to me and give me one of these combs, so it's kind of interesting. Things don't change that much, I guess, over the years. But you can also see that the pattern or this was very clearly identified then also microscopically as definitely being elephant tusk and not some other type of ivory, of which there are a couple of types, right? And of course, Madeline was successful. She found a louse. And here you can see it's very faint, but this kind of shape over here, it's the exoskeleton of a nymph of a louse. And she wanted to get really sophisticated and get DNA analysis done on the blood that the louse might have sucked out of some. It got kind of crazy, but we never had that done. For some reason, it never got done. But at any rate, we have a louse in the between the small teeth of the comb, which was kind of interesting. So this is being done, by the way, in her dining room in her home, with a microscope, and this is COVID. This is 2021. Everything is on lockdown in Israel. Nobody's flying into Israel. Nobody's flying out of Israel. We're still working like crazy. We've got students working on various aspects of the material culture, and she is finally taking out the combs and looking at those. And so she says, okay, I've looked at the comb microscopically. I need to get some overall pictures of the comb. She gets out her brand new iPhone 13. This is not an advertisement for Apple, but anyway, and she takes it, and how we normally do, she's taking a picture and the lighting's not right. So she brings a desk lamp from another room, brings it over, sets it down. So now there's a raking light across the object. And as she's zooming in on the object, she sees something for the first time. 5.5 years later, she sees some scratches on the surface of the comb. I'll show you an image in a moment. But she sees, first of all, this Tav, or X. And she sees this letter here very clearly, another Tav there anyway. And she immediately takes a picture, sends it without anybody's permission, sends it to an epigrapher, Dr. Daniel Weinstub, who we will get to that story here in a moment. And he says, oh my goodness, he says, yes, you definitely have an inscription. I need to see this right away. Here's a picture of that comb. We'll get to some of the details here in a moment. Daniel Weinstub is a lecturer in Bible archaeology in Near East at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. He is a very fine person and an amazing epigrapher as well. He's working here on the Ophel inscription, by the way, that was found in Jerusalem. He's got a new article that recently came out on that. One of the things that we did right away was take it to some imaging locations where we could get really good images to analyze aspects of this. And you can see here various different things. And yeah, so you can see here very clearly that Tav. You can see also very clearly on this side, this center area gets a little bit difficult. This is very interesting, this one here. You want to look at that? Well, there's the Tav. And then what on earth is that? Yeah. So Daniel Weinstube worked on this for several months and I think did a brilliant job. I'm an archaeologist. I'm not an epigrapher, so I'll say that right away. So if you have questions about the epigraphy, you have to ask somebody else. But he interpreted this, I think, correctly as a kof. Now, kof is a monkey in Hebrew. And you have here a head, you have a body, you have a tail, and you even have a couple of legs over here. I'll show you in the drawing, which is, again, an interpretation. By the way, you see how rounded this is on this side? This is worked on this side. This is a complete comb. We didn't find part of it. Of course, the teeth were all broken, but we found the complete comb. So here you see the kof, which is letter 16, and here you see letter 8 is another kof. This one doesn't have the legs, but it's got the head, the body, the tail. That's where our letter Q comes from, of course, if you never knew that, the little Q at the bottom thing. So that's when I get a call, by the way. That's when I get a call and an email from Yossi, and where was this found? We have an inscription. Suddenly a little, obscure. Well, it wasn't obscure. It was ivory. It was a comb. It was an object. But now what we thought was simply a bone becomes something much more significant. And I called Catherine. She came down from Nashville, where she was studying, to Chattanooga, where her family still lives. And thanks to her tenacity, now we do everything digitized there. I've got to move along. I'm looking at my time. We do everything digitized there, but we have backup plans because digitized stuff can disappear, right? So we have multiple layers of backups that we do. And one thing that every Square supervisor has is their own notebook where they keep daily notes. And look at Catherine's daily notes that particular day. She's got a debris area over here. She's got a note, ivory comb found in this area. And then she has a drawing of the ivory comb over here. That was done on that day. So June 20. So feedback from Ed Mahar, drawn in. This is the location. We're using GPS. We're using a total station. So we have very precise, within millimeter measurements of exactly where this was found. And so Catherine and I start the article, and that's how it begins. You have to begin with where it was found and what the archaeological context is. Now let's talk about the archaeological context for a moment, because the big question is, what does this date to, right? And that's determined by the archaeological context, and that's a problem. In our case, not a problem that we don't know where the context it was found in. The problem is that this comb seems to be found in a context that is hundreds of years after when it was probably incised. How do we know that? Well, it was found in a pit dug from level 2 from the Babylonian destruction, or the Babylonian period, probably dug just before the destruction, maybe to hide some stuff. There were whole vessels in this pit. There were a lot of different things. And this comb was found in this larger pit. It was actually a very large pit. And that is problematic because 586 BC is not when we believe this comb came from, based on the epigraphy. So if that doesn't help us much, then we have to do other things. So we've been working with Oxford University for many years on radiocarbon dating with colleagues there. And so we scraped off this is a tiny artifact, so you can't do much with it. You don't want to destroy the artifact, right? So on the back of it, where the inscription is not, we took scrapes of that out and sent it to Oxford. Sorry, it wasn't Cambridge. And Oxford came back and said, sorry, there's not enough carbon in these samples to give you a date. Now, I just a few weeks ago gave a lecture at the Weizmann Institute in near Tel Aviv, and it was filled with a bunch of radiocarbon people that we work with as well. And they said, well, you know why that is, Dr. Hasel? I said, no, I don't. I'm an archaeologist. Tell me. And they said, it's because it's a tooth. And teeth are made primarily of collagen, and collagen doesn't have a lot of carbon usually in it. It's not bone. It is bone, but it's not bone. So I'm, okay, cool. Just in case you wanted that tidbit of information. So the carbon dating didn't help us. We tried twice. We sent 2 samples, 2 separate times to Oxford, no results. And so what do we have left? We have the epigraphy, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Well, I've talked about it a little bit. Let's go back maybe a few slides. Why do we think that this is earlier? Because Koph is not written anywhere like this in the later Canaanite scripts that we have from the late Bronze Age and later. This is pictographic. It's about as pictographic as you can get, isn't it? So this reminds us more of Egyptian hieroglyphics and more of the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions where we have no legs and no tail, but we have a wider circle and a smaller circle for the Koph, which denotes, the body probably and the head. I'm not an expert, but that's what our experts say. By the way, Chris Rolston was our external reviewer of this article. Usually that's an anonymous thing, and it was, but he later disclosed who he was and allowed us to use his name, and he very much likes this translation. So anyway, so Yossi came over. The article came out in October 2022. Yossi came over to our university. This is Linwood Hall Chapel, and we announced it to the public for the first time here. And it was a very exciting day. We had the press releases that went out, and I'm sure you all want to know what this said. So we're getting there. Yes, it says, according to our publication, may this tusk root out lice of hair and beard. Something very banal, something very unpretentious. We were hoping maybe, a king or, a queen or somebody would be mentioned, but it's kind of interesting at the same time, isn't it? That you have an object that has an inscription that describes the function of that object. You don't have that very often in archaeology, or maybe even anywhere. I mean, what objects here? You don't have something that says chair on this object, or desk on this object, or sit here, We don't have that kind of. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of a wish or desire to have this object fulfill what it was designed to do for the recipient that maybe was receiving it. We don't know. But it's interesting. Our phone calls went crazy for the next 3 days, day and night. 2-hour conversation with the science editor of the New York Times. Somebody called me from India for a Zoom meeting or a Zoom thing for television there. It was in 40 news outlets around the world. Poland, all kinds of places were calling. And it was kind of a neat thing. And one might wonder why such a little thing would cause such a stir. And the answer is because it was the first alphabetic sentence found in history, and we still use that alphabet today. Think about it. 75% of the world's population still uses an alphabetic script today. And even with our sophisticated phones, so when we're texting each other, we're still using the same alphabet. So it was really a revolution in communication and writing in many ways. Christianity Today named it as the #1 discovery of 2022 that year. In 2023, the Israel Museum opened a special exhibit on the comb, and I was there for that event. There was also a special symposium on the history of writing and the earliest writing, and that was wonderful. A number of scholars came from Europe and the United States to present there. And here I am standing with my friend, Professor Deaver, who was also there to give a paper. And you can see the BBC special in the background at the Israel Museum that was produced for this comb. And I'm pointing at the tiny little object there, which wasn't very well displayed, I have to say. They there's no raking light here. There's just flat, Anyway, so we brought the comb in January to our university and to our museum. And we kind of were creative with the title. It was fitting in, by the way, these are Assyrians, so it was fitting into an existing exhibit that we had already put together 2 years earlier, focusing on the Sennacherib's campaign to Lachish with 80 artifacts from our excavations and other artifacts from the Yale Babylonian collection. So this was kind of an exhibit within an exhibit, a new opportunity. And in those 3 months that we had the ivory comb, we had more visitors at our museum than we've had in any given year in the last 20 years that we've been open. So it was kind of exciting. We brought over all the players who were involved in finding the comb. Professor Josef Garfinkel is here, Daniel Weinstub, Madeline is sitting here, I'm here, Catherine was there, Chris Rolston came. We had a symposium. But this was kind of interesting because this is the gentleman that was from the Chattanooga Times Free Press, who was the reporter, and we were telling the story of how this happened. And what I find very interesting here is this. He asked Madeline how it felt when she first saw the letters on the comb. And I want to read to you how he later reported this in the Chattanooga. This is the Sunday cover of the Chattanooga Times Free Press. Madeline Mamshuglu looked around, pointing at one scholar and then another who formed part of the chain of analysis, marveling at the teamwork and how easily the comb might have been passed over or simply not found at all. I feel the hand of God there, she said, adding that maybe 2 or 3 times in life you feel a truly special moment, a turning point where something utterly remarkable takes place in which you really had very little to do. I'm standing in the place where the comb was found. It's all covered up today, all grassed over. This was in April. And tiny little objects, huge site, very humbling. Because to find something like that is like finding a needle in a huge, giant haystack and realizing you're only excavating a certain very, very small portion of that site. If we had, for instance, put our squares in just 30 centimeters in this direction, we would have missed it completely. It would have been in the bulk. So that's the situation. So coming back on script now, again. Can we still maintain with Seth Sanders in his article in Ma'arav published in 2004 that the earliest alphabetic texts are typical graffiti? The quick and dirty tool of foreign workers scrawled in desolate places, the mines, the gulch of terror, as the Wadi el-Hol is translated. There's no high culture here. For Sanders, as for Schneidewend, the Wadi el-Hol and Sinai inscriptions represent primitive early advances in alphabetic language in the obscure margins of society that would hardly have an impact until the late Iron Age in the state of Israel, centuries later, a millennium later, really. The language was not yet standardized. It did not represent an official language, and this writing may not have qualified as language at all, speaking of the Sinai and Egyptian inscriptions. But we would like to suggest that these considerations based on data now a century old should be reconsidered for 4 reasons. Number 1, location and context. The ivory comb inscription was found in one of the most prominent Middle Bronze Age cities in Canaan. The ancient site of Lachish, mentioned in cuneiform and biblical texts. This is a period that archaeologists have described as the zenith of urban Canaanite culture, where a sudden revival of urban life was characterized by massively fortified cities like Lachish and others exhibiting superior engineering, advances in technology, including metallurgy, highly centralized and sophisticated town planning, increased agricultural production, craft specialization, made possible by the technological advancement of the fast wheel in pottery production and international trade. The ivory comb inscription was not found in a small, obscure mining community in the desert. Rather, it was found in one of the most developed Canaanite urban centers in history, a site that would later become a most important royal Judean or Judahite city, second only to the capital in Jerusalem. It was also found on the Acropolis of the site, where a long history of temples, palaces, and elite domestic houses were excavated from the Bronze to the Iron Ages. Secondly, the source material. The sentence is inscribed on elephant tusk ivory, a luxury material that has been valued for millennia across cultures. Elephants were prized as a rare species, the largest of all land animals. I took this picture in Botswana a couple of years ago. Its tusk would begin growing at the age of 2 years and continue the entire life of the elephant up to 60 to 70 years. Ivory was beautifully carved and polished into personal ornaments, decoration, and furniture inlay throughout the Bronze and Iron Ages. We have references in the biblical prophets about the decadence. The craftsmanship necessary for the production of these artifacts achieves the level of fine art, demonstrating the enormous amount of time invested in feeding the elite demand for luxury, as well as honing the necessary skills for work. The ivory was brought either from Africa or perhaps from Syria. We have evidence during the reign of Thutmose III of elephants in Syria, where intentional deposits of elephant bones dating back to the end of the Middle Bronze Age were found also at Katna and at Alalach. And here I'll just show you, this is Rechmare's tomb in Egypt, and here we have some remains from the Syrian sites of Alalach as well. And you can see the huge tusks here that were found. The inscription is a complete sentence. Sorry, I skipped something. The entire process of hunting, killing, harvesting the ivory cut into smaller pieces, object honed and cut and polished, carving out the spaces between the narrow and wide teeth, all needed to occur before the inscription was written on the precious object. And that was a process requiring considerable more investment than simply scribbling on a rock in some deserted Sinai location. The inscription itself is a complete sentence with verb, subject, and 2 objects. It even contains, Daniel Weinstub would argue, a direct object marker later found in Hebrew. This indicates that alphabetic writing is complete sentences was possible in Canaan by the early 2nd millennium BC, and it's still debated whether the Egyptian and Sinai inscriptions composed complete sentences. That's a debate. Most of these inscriptions are poorly preserved and partial, so as a result, we have argued that the ivory comb inscription is the earliest example among a total of 12 other Canaanite inscriptions that have been excavated at Lachish by various expeditions. The ivory comb inscription is therefore not an isolated object, but part of a long tradition of writing found at Lachish. Finally, the message. Sorry, that's this slide. As mundane and banal as the inscription seems to be, it is unusual in the field of archaeology to have a text, as we said, on an artifact that describes specifically the function of the object. Regardless, the wish describes the purpose of the comb, and the remaining presence of a louse by microscopic analysis indicates the successful execution of its intended function. Literacy and communication. In 2010, Chris Rolston concluded in his book, Writing and Literacy in Ancient Israel, the epigraphic evidence demonstrates that elites in ancient Israel were writing during the Iron Age 2A and onward. And I'm absolutely certain that a nation, Israel, that has a scribal apparatus that is capable of developing a national script and employing standardized orthographic conventions is certainly capable of producing literature. For the first time in Canaan, and what later became Israel, we have the alphabetic script now traced back 700 years earlier to the Middle Bronze Age, and the ability existed at this time for an individual to cogently write a sentence expressing the desire for a particular object to perform the function it was created to do. In our article, published in the Jerusalem Journal of Archaeology, we cited a similar sentence from the Babylonian Talmud. And he sent to her a comb that kills lice. For the first time, and here I'm going out on a little limb, forgive me, but for the first time, might we not surmise that these early 2nd millennium inhabitants of Lachish and their later descendants, if they could write something this banal, yet complete on an object like this, could we not also surmise that they could produce the kinds of literature that Jewish scribes could produce during the Babylonian exile? In other words, if something this mundane and banal as hair lice could be addressed by individuals in both periods, why couldn't people in both periods also have the capability to write things that are more sophisticated? Some might say this is too far-reaching to suggest, but before now, we didn't have the parallel of these two sentences saying very similar things, yet separated by such a long period of time. So in conclusion, Our regional project in the Southern Shephelah in Israel modestly set out almost 20 years ago to investigate the small unexcavated site of Khirbet Qeiyafa. I want to thank Professor Garfinkel and Sarga Noor for their invitation to join that project at the SBL meetings in 2007 and our subsequent work together over the years. Archaeological fieldwork is all about teamwork and interdisciplinary research, and at Khirbet Qeiyafa we uncovered the earliest material remains of Israel's first kings, including what we have argued are the first and oldest Hebrew inscriptions found in 2008 and 2012. We began thinking about a regional project, and after surveying and trying to excavate at Sukkot, we expanded to Tel Lachish, the largest undisturbed royal city in the monarchy. There we found more Canaanite inscriptions from the late Bronze Age, and I just want to point out that 12 inscriptions have been found here over the years by various expeditions. Here you have two of them, the famous Ewer bowl there that you see. And this is one that we found in 2014, published in 2015. Again, partial. All these inscriptions that we find in Canaan are partial. Just a few letters here and there, few words, maybe, no complete sentences. We expanded the area when we found this to find the rest of the jar. And instead we found a late Bronze Age temple. But that's another story that we can't talk about here today. That's another lecture. While we were excavating at Lachish, my colleagues decided to branch over 3 kilometers away to another site called Khirbet el-Rai, which were excavated by Yosef Garfinkel, Sarga Noor, and Kyle Keimer. And there, working at el-Rai over the last several years, another inscription was found that added to the corpus going back a bit further. And this was the Ostrakhan from Khirbet el-Rai with the name Jerubbaal, which could be similar to the Gideon of the Bible. The date is correct of the context of the 12th to 11th century, although we only have the name and no further context, so we only can make that kind of parallel. The publication, by the way, has been fully published now in, yes, your journal here, the Journal of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. Okay, you can find it there. At Lachish, as I said, we had a number of other important, all these other important. So today, what we can do, just from these 3 sites, and there are maybe more to fill in from other places as well, we have produced a number of inscriptions following a direct line of development of the alphabet in the southern territory of Canaan and early Judah. This line of progression of alphabetic writing in Canaan and Judah demonstrate not only that people wrote, but that the distribution of the alphabetic writing system in its earliest beginnings was much more extensive than has been previously known. Now I know I'm out of time. Can I have 5 more minutes? Not going to work because I know we have 25 minutes left. I have to drive to Heathrow yet tonight, so I'm in a rush to get out too. But anyway, let me just say this. I spent the last, I'm going to skip this slide. I spent the last 4 months living in Jerusalem as a fellow at the Albright and working on the final publication series. And you meet a lot of different people when you're working there, including a visit by Dr. Deaver and his wife Pam. But I also had an invitation to celebrate the festival of Purim with a family that I hadn't spent much time with, only the Dr. Debbie Casuto, who works on our loom weights and is an expert on textiles and weavings, invited me over with a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Steve Ortiz, the director of the excavations at Gezer, and his colleague, Dr. Seth Rodriguez. And after Debbie's husband, Hanoch Casuto, MD, PhD, a renowned pediatric neurologist in Jerusalem, had the Shabbat blessing over the meal and broke bread, we began a conversation about the depth of the biblical story of Esther, which of course Purim is celebrating. And Dr. Hanoch asked us whether we knew anything about the biblical story and what we knew. And we all told him that we also taught Bible in Hebrew language. And then he asked us this question. I'll never forget it. Standing at the head of the table, Seth Rodriguez is next to me. I'm here. Steve Ortiz is across on the other side. He says, "Are you Wellhausen interpreters of the Bible?" I was kind of stunned by that question. I have never had that question before. And Dr. Rodriguez responded immediately and answered without hesitation, "We are Moses interpreters of the Torah." He said, "Really? Well, I'm open to different ideas, but this is intriguing," he said. And then I asked him a question. I asked him, "How are you related to Professor Umberto Cassuto?" Some of you know that name. And he said, "He was my great-grandfather." And I had chills at that moment. What an honor. And I told him that my father was trained as an Old Testament scholar, and I inherited in my father's library several of his commentaries on Genesis and Exodus, including his book. By the way, this is him. He fled in 1939 from Italy. He was teaching in Rome when fascism came into play, 1939, what was happening in that part of the world. He fled to Jerusalem, and he spent the last part of his life till 1961 and his death working and teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And here are some of his books. The Documentary Hypothesis, 8 lectures, published in 1941 in English. But in the 30s, he had dismantled Wellhausen's hypothesis of the late dating of the text, arguing for the Torah's early authenticity. He asked me, "Do you have the Hebrew or the English books?" I said, "I don't do modern Hebrew, so I have the English, unfortunately." But that began a conversation. And he wanted to know what have been the latest findings. And Dr. Ortiz shared about his discovery of the famous Ekron inscription at the Israel Museum now in 1996. And then we got to talking about other things. By the way, Diana Edelman, who taught at Sheffield among the minimalists, was working with us when this inscription was found, and we specifically invited her to come and watch this being excavated out of the ground. Because her colleague was Philip Davies, and we did not want any accusations that this might be a planted forgery or something. I kid you not, Neil Biertling was there videoing the whole thing. And she confirmed that this was definitely an archaeological artifact and not a forgery, so that was good. And then I shared details. We talked about, the Tel Dan inscription, and then I began to share details about the ivory comb and its discovery. And I won't go into all of that because you heard it all today. And Dr. Cassuto, who had never heard of the comb discovery, when I told him what the comb said, I shared with him how for the first time we have a Semitic text dating back to about 1700 BC, more or less. And he excitedly said, "That's the time of Abraham." Depends on how you date that. But anyway, I said, "Your great-grandfather would have been so thrilled to have a discovery indicating the alphabetic writing was possible already during the time of the patriarchs." And just as we were talking about this, the sirens went off. All of Jerusalem was under alert and blaring across the city, and all of us immediately got up from the dinner table, and we all rushed down to the air raid shelter, where there we were surrounded by now 5 different families from that small community of houses that shared that air raid shelter. And Dr. Cassuto, who I'm sure is very well respected in that affluent community, began immediately sharing in Hebrew with the entire group what I had just shared about the ivory comb and how remarkable this discovery was for the history of writing and communication for the Bible. Here we were, forced into a shelter for about 15 minutes, in a space where no one had a choice while the sirens were wailing outside. But Dr. Cassuto, the great-grandson of Umberto Cassuto, shared an exciting new discovery about an inscription dating several hundred years before the time of Moses. I have a picture that I took. I was sitting in the corner. I was standing in the corner of this room, and I took pictures. Is that okay? There he is. Some were looking at the, by the way, I just got a notification on the way up here that there was another air raid siren going off in Jerusalem. But anyway, they're looking to see when they can leave, probably some of them. But there they all were listening. And I realized at that moment that even in the midst of war, even in the midst of a group of people huddled together in a shelter to survive an impending attack, in the midst of great uncertainty about the future of a country that could also affect the entire world, and God's people who live on both sides of that conflict, struggling to survive. One passage came to mind, Isaiah 40, verse 8. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God stands forever. These words on this ivory comb, as banal as they are something tangible that at least some people can hold on to. That fortifies faith and belief, even if that faith and belief in the end does not depend on a tiny comb, 3,700 years old. So as we sit here today, exactly 500 years almost after Tyndale gave us the word in our own common English language, the question we might ask ourselves tonight is, do we still believe? Do we still believe without equivocation and compromise? Will we have the courage to believe the word giver and have an enduring faith in the word he gave? I'm not talking about a comb now. And really, if we who gather in this place will not, who will? So that's the challenge I leave with you this evening. Thank you.